Hi, in this video I'm going to cover outer track rod and inner track rod removal and replacement. Now you can see I've already turned the steering all the way to the right, and that's so that I can get access to this nut and also get access to the rest of the track rod, which is here. I fix up accident damaged cars, and so the reason I'm replacing mine is because you can see this is bent here. This should actually be completely straight. Okay, so let's make a start and get ready to change our outer track rod. And the first job whenever you're working on suspension on a car is to put some WD-40 on all of the bolts that you know you're going to undo. So we know that this nut here on the ball joint's going to need to come loose. So a little bit on there. And then finally you can just see it underneath here. There's like a little cap head. Probably takes a Torx bit, to be honest. That needs to be loosened when you're disassembling these two parts. So if you're only changing one of them, then you will need to undo that. If you're replacing both of them together as a unit, you may not need to undo that. Okay, so to remove the outer track rod, the first job is to undo this nut here. So I'm just going to get a breaker bar onto that nut. Now you see that wasn't too bad. And as long as that center shaft doesn't start spinning, then I'll be able to undo it all of the way just using a ratchet now. If the taper's not kind of bound, it hasn't got rusty or whatever, then the center shaft will just start to spin and the nut won't be coming undone. So I'll just show you that. See how that center shaft is spinning. So what you can do is just hold that center shaft still using a Torx bit, or sometimes it's an Allen key, so a hex bit. Now on this particular car it's a T40, and then I can just use my quarter drive socket set just to hold that center shaft still. And now of course I can't get a socket on anymore, but if I get a 21mm spanner and it's not as tight now because I've broken it free, then that allows me to undo it. Okay, so the next step in the outer track rod removal is to knock that shaft through, and that will effectively disassemble the ball joint from the bottom of the hub. Now because the nut came off so easily and we could see that center shaft was spinning, this will probably knock through really easy, but you might not be so lucky and you might have to tap it. And one tip that I'll give if you are going to tap that is don't hammer straight onto the top of that shaft there, because if you mushroom it or damage that thread and you do plan to reuse this, say you're only changing the inner one, then that'll be a real pain to try to get that nut back on. If you're not going to use that again, then you can go ahead and just hit the end of the shaft, no big deal, you know. Now I'm actually changing my inner track rod. I haven't decided whether to replace that or not. So what I've got here is just a little brass drift, and so I'm going to place that onto the end. And now I can just tap the top of it with a hammer. And that's a safe way of doing it without risking damaging the end of that shaft. Now I'm just going to straighten up the steering, because when I do that, then this will come out the end more easily. Now because this suspension here is fully extended with the car being jacked up, it's making it really difficult to get that ball joint out of the bottom of the hub. So what I've got here is just a small trolley jack. And what I'll do is I'll just jack up that suspension a little bit. I just have a rubber pad here to put at the bottom where it's going to touch the brake disc. There we go. And that should be just enough that I can get this out of the bottom just like that. So now I can go ahead and just release that jack again. But I'm actually covering both the outer and the inner track rod in this video. And so what I plan to do is just replace this and remove it from the car as a complete unit. So now I have to turn my attention to removal of the inner track rod. Normally where the inner track rod meets the steering rack, you would have a proper boot clip on that, so it would be a steel one, or it might be a Jubilee clip. I've only got a tie wrap. Either way you would probably cut it off with some nice snips, and once you've cut that you can pull that gaiter back. Now at the other end you might have another small one there which holds the other end of the gaiter. I don't know if mine's missing or if it just never had one, but now I'm going to slide this down this way. I've just got some silicone spray to spray onto the shaft just here. and that should make this boot slide more easily. Now this part of the steering rack here has got a little bit of dirt on it, so I'll make sure I clean this up really well before I put a new boot on. Okay, to change a inner track rod, you have to undo this nut here. And just a few things to say about that is, first of all, on this shaft, which is part of the steering rack, there's a couple of flats here, which I'm hoping you can just see. And you would get a spanner on there, and that would allow you to hold the rack still. Now, sometimes this nut, depending on what model of car you've got, there'll actually be a pin pushed through. So it might be at the top or it might be at the bottom. Or there might be some kind of a grub screw or other screw. So it's worth checking all the way around this hex and making sure there's nothing that's securing it apart from just you know, the nut itself. This BMW doesn't have one, but I know some other models of cars do. So make sure you do check, otherwise you'll never get that undone. Okay, so I actually had to grind down a spanner to find one the right size. It started off as a 32mm, it's probably nearer 36 now. And now, do you remember me saying that there were flats here on the steering rack? Well, that's 24. So at least something a bit more manageable, huh? Okay. So now I'm just spinning the whole track rod. It doesn't really matter if you're doing the inner track rod or the outer track rod. I recommend that you take it off of the car purely for the reason that you can get it on the bench and into a vise like I have. You can change them on the car, but it makes it a lot more difficult. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you how to replace the outer track rod on here. And it's just a case of getting it off of the inner. And then of course, if you were replacing the inner one, you would remove the outer one in exactly the same way, and you would replace just this section, which is exactly what I'm going to do. But let's start with the outer one first. So I've cleaned it all up with the wire brush here, just like that. And then I've got some WD-40, and that should hopefully make things a bit easier for us. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is undo this locking nut. And we are going to mark where the outer track rod attaches onto this thread, but only once we've got that nut out of the way, because any mark that we do here on the thread with a paint pen will just come off when we undo that nut. So they'll all be different, these, but this is quite an unusual size, and I actually found an Imperial spanner that fits it best, so this one's 7/8. Now bear in mind, mine's bent, so I won't be able to undo this very far. And that came off much easier than I expected, so I'll confess that I had my torch to hand here, and if that had been super tight then I'd have just warmed it up a bit, just for a few minutes. You don't have to get it cherry red or anything like that, just nice and hot, and that's enough to make that much easier to remove. Anyway, I got lucky on this occasion, so save that for next time. As I mentioned, normally that nut would unscrew all the way back, and that would expose the thread. And at that point I would get in there and I would mark with the paint pen. Okay, so this is just for my own particular situation. Because I know I'm replacing the inner track rod, I'm not going to use it again, and I can't undo that nut fully because it's so bent. What I'm going to do is I can just get a narrow hacksaw blade in there, and what I'm going to do is mark on the thread, and then once I've got this outer track rod off, I can measure how far from the end it was. So I'm just going to go into this gap here with a junior hacksaw, and I'm just going to put a mark on the shaft. It goes without saying, if you're just replacing this outer track rod, then don't cut the blade into the shaft. Move that nut fully back and do a paint mark, because you don't want to weaken the inner track rod, you see. But for the sake of argument, let's pretend we've rotated that nut fully out of the way and we have access to the end of this track rod here. What I would do is I would clean it with some brake cleaner, give it a good wipe down, and then using a paint pen I would get right into the corner, as far into the edge as I can, and then let that dry. And then once we remove this outer track rod, you'll be able to see how far it came up to. Now the next step, on this particular car there's a little locking screw there, and as you can see it's a Torx one, and it's actually a T50, so I have a little set of Torx sockets. I'm just going to pop that in there, and that allows me to get a ratchet on it which should give me plenty of leverage to undo that. Oh jeez, that's tight. As you can see, I put quite a lot of force on that then, and I really don't want to strip that out. So maybe the blowtorch is going to get a bit of use after all, so I was hoping I'd be able to demo it. What I'll do is I'll make sure anything flammable like other aerosol cans and bits of paper and other things are all out of the area, and then we'll get on with that. So as you see, the heat helped, but it was still really tight. I actually had the strong bar on there instead of the ratchet at the end. I managed to get it undone about half a turn, but that'll allow a little bit of WD-40 in now, so I'm going to try the WD-40 again. It's worth taking your time, because if you shear off the bolt and it snaps in there, and you were hoping to use that again, then you'd be in a bit of a mess. So in the end, despite my best efforts, that little bolt which tightens up the outer track rod to the inner one sheared off, and obviously you saw me soaking it with WD-40 and using a little bit of heat, unfortunately to no avail, and it sheared off. I could have drilled out, re-tapped and done all that sort of stuff, but I'm quite happy to be putting a new one on. It only cost 25 quid, so it didn't seem worth messing around. Okay, so let's continue as if we've just undone this bolt. So your next step would be, where this split is, just widening that a little bit, and that will make it loose on the thread and make it easier to undo it. So what you do is you just get a nice stout screwdriver and get it down one side, and then give it a tap with a hammer, and at the other side as well. So there's actually some flats, like a little hex shaped part of the inner tie rod, and that's where I'm holding it in the vise. And then similarly on the outer tie rod here, there's some flats that you can get a spanner onto. Oh, there we go. So it was easy in the end, he says. Easy once it comes off, isn't it? And you can see just how much of the thread from the inner tie rod screws into this outer one. You know, it's quite a distance. There we go. So if I hadn't had this problem with this bolt snapping off, I'd be able to just screw it now onto this new one and make sure I screwed it on exactly the same length as the old one, to the markings that we put on earlier. So if you remember, I put a very fine saw cut onto this thread, and that's because I knew that I wasn't going to be using this part again. Alternatively, you can use like a paint pen or something like that. But what that allows me to do now is to measure that, and that's about 41 millimeters. So this will get me in the right ballpark when I fit my new part, but I may decide to go ahead and get the tracking done anyway, but at least it'll be close until I'm able to get that done. Okay, so I've got my new inner tie rod here, and all I'm going to do is unscrew this cover off of the thread. Could do it later, but I might as well do it now. And then just in here, this is a little ball joint where it goes onto the steering rack. And here I have some CV grease. And what I'm going to do, this is already greased a little bit, but I'm just going to put a little bit of extra in there, just to make sure it's got enough in there to keep that ball joint moving nicely. Bought a new bellows because my old one was split. So I'm just going to pop that on now, because I won't be able to get it on later once I've put the outer tie rod onto here. And I'm just going to use a little bit more of this grease just to lubricate these threads a little bit, because you've seen how hard they are to get off. So even though I bought a new outer and inner tie rod in the end, neither one of them gave me a new one of these nuts. So what I'm going to do is just remove this one so that then I can use it again. Okay, so I've got the old locking nut here. It doesn't matter reusing the old one, because you know, it's only a locking nut at the end of the day. And I'm just going to screw it on to the measurement that we got off the old inner tie rod. And now I can go ahead and screw on my new outer track rod. Okay, so now I'm getting close. I'm just going to hold that nut to make sure it doesn't spin just as I snug this up to it. Okay, so that's just hand tight onto there. So this is a new locking bolt. and this is of course a new inner track rod. But if these weren't new, what you'd want to do is clean both of them up with brake cleaner, so the thread on the bolt and then the inner thread inside the track rod. And the reason for that is in a minute we're going to be torquing these up, and torque settings are always with clean threads. Okay, so now that we've got this all clean, I'm going to start tightening up this locking bolt, but I'm just going to do it hand tight, because then I'm going to refer to my technical manual for the correct tightening torque. So I just keep my laptop out here in the garage so that I can refer to it quickly when I need to. And here's the section that we need, so you can see the outer tie rod here, and the locking bolt is number 1 there. And it's telling me that the torque here is 2AZ, so I just follow that link. And it brings up this table here, and 2AZ is the one in the middle there. So if we just pan to the right, you can see that the torque's only 32 Newton meters, so it's not very high at all. Probably whoever fitted it last time did it really tight, and that's why I had a lot of trouble kind of splitting the two parts back apart again. I got that technical manual from eManual online, and they're the same manuals that the technicians for the manufacturers use, so they've got lots of really great content. You can literally just search it up and find whatever you need really, so I use them a lot. But anyway, I'll put a link in the video description below if you're interested in them. And in the meantime, it's time to get this tightened up. So anyway, I've got my smaller torque wrench, and I'm going to set it to 32 Newton meters, which is what the e-manual told us. So I can go ahead and get that tightened up now. And because it's the right torque, not only will it not come undone, but also I'll be able to get it undone if I need to do this job again. Don't forget to back your torque wrench back off again when you're finished with it, otherwise it'll lose its calibration. And what my dad told me recently, and I wasn't aware of, is you don't back it off all the way to 0 so that there's no tension on it at all. You actually back it off to the lowest setting that's displayed. So on this torque wrench, that's 8 Newton meters. There we go, put that back on the shelf for later. Now the technical manual doesn't have a torque setting for this, and I wouldn't be able to get my torque wrench on anyway because I can only use it with sockets. But we know because it's just a locking nut, it doesn't have to be that tight. So I'm just going to nip it up really. And I'm going to aim for something similar to what I just did. So I have a bit of a feel for what 32 Newton meter feels like because I just did it. So that's what I'm going to aim for. Okay, I think that feels about right. So when I bought this outer tie rod, then it came with a new ball joint nut, which is just here. And when I was looking at the technical manual a minute ago, I noticed there was a torque setting for that as well. So I'm just going to refer back to that quickly, and then we'll go and get this fitted. So this diagram here shows the outer track rod, which is what we're interested in. And here's the nut that holds it onto the hub. So just referring back to the instructions, we can see that the tightening torque is 3AZ. Similar to before, we can go into the table for the torque settings, and then we can see here that the tightening torque is 175 Newton meters. Okay, so we're back on the car now, and if you remember, we had a split boot where the inner tie bar meets the steering rack. And so there's a risk that some of this here is dirty, you know, maybe a bit of grit or dirt in it. So what I'm going to do is just clean this up a little bit. So again, I've just got my brake cleaner here. Going to put some, spray some onto there. And the teeth of the rack and pinion is just at the back here. So just give that a squirt too. Okay, so hopefully there's no grit in there now. Now there's a thread in the end, if you remember where we screw our inner tie bar to it. I'm just going to clean that thread because a little bit of Loctite goes on it. And Loctite doesn't like grease and oil being present. Similar to earlier, I've got my CV grease here. I really struggle to say this word, but I'm going to try. It's got molybdenum in it. But anyway, that's really good friction reducing additive that goes into grease. So I'm just going to get a little bit on there. Don't have to get loads on there, but just replacing what I wiped off a minute ago. Okay, so we're about ready to replace our inner track rod, and of course it's got the outer one fastened to it as well. Now this is a new piece, of course, because I'm replacing both of them. But if I was reusing this, then I'd be wanting to make sure that thread's clean there. So similar to what we did before, just give that a little squirt with brake cleaner to make sure it's clean, and use a section of a clean cloth. Okay, so we've got that ready to go. And now just a blob of Loctite on it. So I use this Loctite 2400, and like I said, it's a medium strength thread lock. I find it to be really good, so I'll put a link to that in the description. And now you might be able to see, because mine's a new part, that there's a little bit of a like a thread lock paint that's been added by the factory. But I'm still going to put my own blob of this on, and you don't need a huge amount on there, so hopefully you can see kind of how much I put on. And now we're ready to screw that in. You can see I'm just kind of spinning this at the ball joint end, and effectively, because this ball is quite stiff, it's screwing it on. I mentioned that I don't have a torque wrench that's got open-ended jaws. I think most people don't, but I've looked in the technical manual and the torque for that is 105. So I know it's quite tight from when I loosened it off. But remember, there's some flaps just here on the end of the rack, because what you don't want to do is tighten that up and twist the inner shaft of the rack, because it's quite delicate. Okay, so this is the large spanner that's on the nut now, which is on the inner tie bar. And then I'm just going to hold the rack using this 24mm spanner. And then remember, the torque we're looking for is 105, so I'm going to have to estimate that. But also there's Loctite on the threads, so that's going to do quite a good job at making sure it doesn't come loose. Okay, let's get that nipped up. And all I'm going to do at this stage is just get this boot pushed over, because I don't want to get dirt inside there. It's actually kind of like a plasticky boot rather than a rubber one. So it really didn't want to expand enough to go over at this end, which is why I struggled with it. But anyway, it's on there now. So the Febby Bilstein boot kit comes with new clips, and obviously the bigger one goes to this side. But you need a pair of these special pliers when you're fitting these clips, so I'll put a link to this in the description. But of course you can also use a Jubilee clip or a tie wrap. The tie wrap probably won't grip it quite as tight, but as long as it holds it on there, you'll probably be okay. Okay, so that's just loosely hooked on at the moment. And when you're using these, where the little hook is, which is about there, it's always worth just putting your thumb on that and making sure it stays in the slot. And then just give this a little squeeze just to tighten it up. And that's it, that's all there is to it. So we can go ahead and do the smaller one now, which is over on this other side. Now I've just measured it at the other side, and the boot should start about 100mm from where the outer tie rod starts, which is about there. So I just need to scoot this forward a little bit. Okay, so we're about ready to put the outer track rod back onto the hub. So I'll just get this little cover off of it. There we go. And the new outer tie rod came with a new nut, so I'm just going to pop that on top there. You probably noticed I didn't put any grease or Loctite on that thread, and that's because we don't need any Loctite because it's a new nut and it's like a self-locking type. If I was reusing the old nut, I'd probably put a drop or two of Loctite on the thread there, just like I showed you earlier. And then to tighten it up, this particular tie rod needs an Allen key at the top, so this is a 7mm Allen key. And then the nut itself is 21mm, so I'm just going to go ahead and tighten that nut down. And what I'll do is I'll just snug that up reasonably tight. And because that shaft under there, it's basically a taper, that'll lock it into the hub. And so now I don't need the Allen key anymore to stop the shaft from spinning. And that means I can get a socket now onto the top and put the final torque on. And if you remember from the electrical technical manual, the torque for that nut is 175 Newton meters, so I'm just going to set it on my large torque wrench. So that's the inner and outer track rod replacement complete. I hope you liked the video, and if you did, then please give me a thumbs up. If you've got any questions at all, just drop me a message in the comments and I'll try to help if I can. And finally, if you enjoyed the content and you want to see more, then please consider subscribing, and maybe I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, bye for now.